Hi there, welcome back for the final episode of the Mind Your Liberty podcast. I'm your host, Andrew. Thanks for joining me today. So, as it happens, I have not been able to get a podcast episode out all year long, except for that episode in January. So, with that in view, I am going to bid you all adieu for now, and I'm not going to re-up my subscription to Podbean to host the podcast, because I'm not going to pay for something I'm not using. I've really enjoyed doing the podcast over the past few years, and I wish I could have kept doing it, but honestly, I think my interests have just shifted as I've become self-employed. I've had time, and I've chosen to spend it on other things that bring in income, basically, and I'm going to choose not to spend the money on the hosting service. But I certainly wanted to thank you all again for listening, and I will keep the channel on YouTube active, so you can go subscribe to me over on YouTube, and if I find some time, have something interesting to share, I'll go ahead and share it there. I've been getting some random new subscriptions. I don't know if they're just spam accounts or what, but I've been getting oddly more subscribers, even though I haven't been putting out content. So that's kind of weird. You can go subscribe to Mind Your Liberty on YouTube. And that way, if there is anything, be sure and hit the bell notification. If there ever is anything new that I get to put out, it'll be put out over there. I think YouTube even has a podcast hosting service now too. They came out with it last year. I never even looked into it. So, as you can tell, this is nothing fancy. I'm recording this in my car as I have a spare minute and I'm thinking of it. I got to cancel my Podbean before it re-ups, and I get charged whatever, $150 or whatever it is. So unless somebody sends me $150, I'll re-up, but no guarantees on me. No, I'll cancel that. I'm not committing to putting out any content this year. So I got other interests and focuses. It was a blast. I learned a ton. Really enjoyed doing it. Thanks for following me as I read the documents and had the conversations. And certainly, just because the Mind Your Liberty podcast is not putting out content anymore, still continue to mind your liberty. All right, and I was thinking I should leave you guys with some recommendations, just from my personal taste, what I listen to, although I haven't gotten to listen to near the volume of podcasts that I used to. Personally, and this is all over the board, not necessarily political, there's, first of all, the 10th Amendment Center podcast is, bar none, I don't listen to it, I can't keep up with it anymore, but they're still fantastic, and I would if I could keep up with it. Michael Bolden at the 10th Amendment Center does a blog called the, I can't remember what it's called, 10th Amendment Center, Path to Liberty, maybe. And it's fantastic. Check it out. It's similar, a lot of historical documents and historical stuff. That's what got me started and why I started my podcast. So that's probably the biggest recommendation, even though I don't personally listen to every episode anymore. I still cherry pick some. And then also the Bright Hearth podcast is a podcast on all things homemaking, geared towards men and women. And very good Christian podcast from the boys out in Ogden, Utah, Brian Suave. And can't recommend that one enough. And don't hate me, but I like Doug Wilson's blog and Mablog. I can't keep up with that one either. I end up deleting most of them, but he's always fun to listen to. I always learn something if I do have time. Then the Bear Grease podcast, again, always learn something. Clay Newcomb does a great job he actually scripts a podcast, and so there's the Bear Grease podcast that's actually scripted, and he puts that out once a week generally, and sometimes it's just stories, like during deer season every year they do deer stories, during turkey season every year they do turkey stories, But then everything else, he actually writes the podcast on a narrative on something Americana, basically. It's searching for things forgotten but relevant, insight in unlikely places, and where we tell the story of Americans who live their lives close to the land. Something like that is their tagline. Very interesting. Clay's a cool guy, always has interesting guests on. And then on the back half of the week, they have a forum discussion, basically a panel discussion about that week's podcast. So if panel discussions aren't your cup of tea, it's non-scripted, then skip that. And then they also have the This Country Life podcast on that same feed. That's Brent Reeves. I don't care for that podcast personally. I normally skip it. It's a good podcast. It's just not really my style. I like the original Bear Grease podcast. I wish they'd kick Brent Reeves off that feed. Personally, nothing against him. But you might find it interesting. Check it out. It's on the Bear Grease podcast feed from the Meat Eater Network. And then, let's see what else. There's some language in it, but I listened to Liberty Lockdown from Clint Russell. That one I can generally keep up with because he doesn't put out content even every week. So I try and keep up with him. Again, there's profanity in it, but, so if that bothers you, stay away. But it's great analysis, libertarian, but like sane libertarian, Mises Caucus libertarian, Austrian economics. Like the guy actually not chop your baby's kids' parts off libertarian, not left libertarian. So those would be my recommendations. Trying to think if there's any others. All right, a couple more. Gary DeMar podcast. Gary DeMar, also controversial, kind of like Doug Wilson. Depending on where you sit, you might hate me for listening to Gary DeMar, but I think he's a very clear-thinking individual that asks good questions, and that's always good to listen to. I enjoy the Gary DeMar podcast, although I can't keep up with him either. He puts out a lot of content, and a lot of it's geared towards eschatology. You can generally tell from the title. If you want to skip the eschatology, skip the eschatology. I think it's similar to Clint Russell. I think his analysis and the way he thinks, I really appreciate, and I think it's very clear and it's the way I would love to think through things. So Gary DeMar podcast, and then the Martyr Made podcast. Again, you might hate me for it, but I discovered him after Tucker. I never listened to the Tucker podcast that Daryl Cooper did with Tucker, but it blew the world up, and I heard that it blew up because of this guy Daryl Cooper. So I started listening to him from the beginning. I'm only 2 or 3 or 4 podcasts in, but really enjoyed it, and the historical breakdown of Zionism and how we got our modern state of Israel. Very good. Some of it I already heard, some of it filled in the gaps. I think he's very fair with both sides of that commentary. So those would be my other 2. Actually, one more. This one's a more tame one that is not as controversial. There's the Double Take podcast from World Radio. That's always a good one. Again, it's scripted. They actually produce it. It's a production, and it's always entertaining. It's good journalism, good thought-provoking journalism, and stories that are going on, stuff to think about. I enjoy listening to that podcast too. But anyway, I'll stop rambling and wish you all a happy new year. Hope everything's going well. And again, be sure and mind your own liberty. Nobody's going to do it for you.